Okay, so can I welcome everybody to this seminar? It's held as part of a series of seminars from the International Consortium for Communication in Healthcare, which is what the little mnemonic at the top of the screen here, I imagine you have the same, means. That's in collaboration with a range of universities from across the world, and here today we're focused on research done in the ESRC-funded CAS Centre here at Lancaster University, but with also colleagues from Leeds University, as we'll see. Today we're going to be talking about a specific project, the Questioning Vaccination Discourse project, rather cleverly called Quo VaDis, and the team with us today are going to be telling us about what they have learned. So it's what we have learned is the theme today. Of course, that presupposes that you've learned something, so I'm delighted to hear that. I think this was a large project funded by the ESRC in the UK, once again, the Economic and Social Research Council. And we're going to talk to the team members today, and I'm going to try and find out what they have learned, but also you'll discover I shall be critical. I shall be trying to discover why they did things in certain ways, how they might have done things differently, why we should believe what they're saying to us, and also what impact that might have actually on everyday lives, medical practice, etc. I'll be trying to probe along those lines. So I hope you enjoy this journey. I'm looking forward to it enormously. And what we're going to do is, as I introduce each team member, I'll get you to talk to just for a moment about who you are, and then we'll start to dive in. And I'm the sort of roving finger here, and people will probably be now worried about who's going to be first. So actually, Will, I think I'll talk to you first. I know a little about the project, so I've thought of the sequence in which I'll talk to you. And I thought I'd talk to you first, Will, because I think I'm right in saying that you deal with data on the project. So if you could just introduce yourself, Will, maybe we'll start talking about that. You'll have to unmute first.
Yeah, so hello everyone. So my name is William Dance. I'm one of the two senior research associates on the Quo VaDis project. I'm based here in the CAS Centre in Lancaster, and kind of generally I specialise in corpus-based discourse analysis.
Okay, so you've mentioned this word corpus already. I remember once when I was talking about corpus linguistics, somebody from the research councils misheard me and thought I was talking about corpse linguistics and wondered what on earth I was doing. So first of all, Will, what is this corpus linguistics stuff?
So corpus linguistics is essentially the study of data sets or large language corpora, collections of text that are too large to study by hand. So sometimes we're talking hundreds of thousands of words, sometimes we're talking tens of millions of words.
Okay.
So corpus refers to the Latin for body, and we're just talking about large bodies of data.
Okay, nothing to do with dead bodies then. Good.
No.
Okay, in that case, let me be a bit skeptical for a moment and say, well, why should I want to look at large bodies of data? What will I get from it? You know, if I want to look at something like vaccination discourse, I could pick up a few leaflets, talk to a few people about what they think about vaccination and hypothesize on the basis of that. You know, what does dealing with a very large volume of data buy me?
So the benefit of these methodologies and these methods is the analysis we have done and the conclusions we have reached have been drawn from vast data sets across social media or parliamentary records or newspapers or kind of Victorian materials. And like I said, these corpora vary from a few 100,000 words all the way up to tens of millions of words, and they're designed to be representative of the topic we're investigating. So if I give you an example, so
Yeah.
We've looked at Mumsnet, for example, where we collected 31 million words of data encompassing every mention of the word vaccine and its variations across about 20 years or so. So this means when we do our analysis, when we look at these corpora, it's not just a kind of small sample that's confirming what we already thought. It's data-driven approaches to explore patterns of discourse and patterns of language.
So might you be able to find, for example, you've already mentioned representatives, so I guess you might argue if we just use small samples, we may not actually be able to say which is the sort of majority view or whether something's a minority view, etc. But do you find sort of subtle hidden messages in there that might be very difficult to find with small samples, for example?
Yeah, so the benefit of using these corpus approaches is you can take very large data sets, but you can also narrow in on the data at the same time. So, you can look at patterns over 10, 20 years, but also you can look at individual tweets or individual Mumsnet posts or individual newspaper articles and really kind of narrow in and see the kind of subtle building of meaning.
Well, let's park that for a moment, because I'll just sort of give advance warning and say, Tara, I'll talk to you next, because I know you know a lot about these corpus methods, and I'll carry on quizzing on the method. But I've got a rough idea of it from you now, Will. What is Mumsnet, by the way?
So Mumsnet is a parenting forum. It's been around since about, I think, 2001. So it's been around since, the early days of the internet. And originally it was designed as a classic internet forum for parents to pool their kind of resources and answer questions and support each other. And it's grown into having, I think, about 1.6 billion page views a year. So it's turned into quite a massive thing, really.
It's a big thing. Yeah. Okay. So how on earth do you gather data from there? Because, you've given me your pitch, you want to gather lots of data. How do you do it? Is it easy? Is it just pressing a little button or saying to ChatGPT, please gather me all the data from Mumsnet? What do you do?
Yeah, I wish it were clicking a button, but it can be a bit more sophisticated than that. So when you collect any kind of data set, it has to be, carefully thought out. There are various aspects to consider. So first of all, you need to make sure you're collecting your data in a principled way and you're gathering data for what you're actually interested in, and there isn't, potentially kind of extraneous topics or extraneous data that can blur the picture. So some data sets need to be more focused, where you really narrow in, and others need to be more diverse. And there's decisions such as, is it going to be spread over time? Is it going to be just original posts or original posts and replies and that kind of thing?
Okay, so is it computationally complex to gather this stuff, or is it just a sort of pain in the neck?
Yeah, I mean, there are some very kind of complex processes when it comes to collecting this data, and there's also important decisions in processing the data too. So, once you collect these large samples, it's not necessarily ready to go. So we have to make sure anything we access or scrape or download is in kind of corpus friendly file formats, and then whether we want to include things like metadata, which is information about, say, if it's Twitter, the poster, how many likes it's had, and how we're going to incorporate that into the files as well.
Okay. Well, you mentioned a word there, scrape, which sounds terrifically technical, because for me, a scrape is the type of thing you get on your knee or something like that. So what's this scraping business?
So it's essentially the process of accessing openly available data online. So like with Mumsnet or Twitter, for example, you can use official data streams, as with the Twitter Academic API, where you access and download the data and then you process it and make it kind of corpus friendly.
Right. And you've mentioned this idea of corpus friendly a couple of times now. What does that mean? It's a metaphor of some sort, I think, but so exactly what does it mean? What is corpus friendly?
So often if you access data online, it might even come as a Word document or a PDF, or sometimes just as a scanned image. So you want to convert those files into text files or XML files, which essentially can be used by corpus software for analysis.
Okay, so it's the demands of the processing software that dictate the form of the data, and that's corpus friendly.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, got it. That's easy. I can understand that. Oh, well, maybe I do have a few brain cells left. That's helpful. Okay, so the scale of the data then that you gathered for this project, could you just give me an idea of the different sources and the scale of data that you've gathered from each? You've already mentioned Mumsnet, Twitter, etc. Just give us a summary of how big is big then for this purpose. And I know it's focused and you've sampled in various ways, but just the numbers.
Yeah, so if we start with our kind of earliest data set, we built a corpus of Victorian anti-vaccination literature, and that was about 3 million words or so. So that's kind of fairly kind of medium size. And then when we move into the other data sets, we have a Mumsnet data set of vaccine discussions, which is about 6 million words or so. And then we have Twitter archives or corpora of HPV discussions, which are about 15 to 20 million words. And then these are also all kind of downsampled from much kind of larger, broader corpora, which are around the kind of 30, 40 million word mark.
Okay, so this is definitely the type of stuff that you couldn't analyze by hand and eye methods in a human lifetime.
Exactly that, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I've got an idea of the scale of the data, why I might want to look at the data, the types of things I suppose I could in principle start to find that might not be found, or claims I could make that could not be made if I just used small samples or more qualitative methods, though I'm sure there's still a place for that type of research. So let me now move to Tara, if that's okay, Will. Tara, tell me about you just briefly.
Hi, I'm Tara Coltman-Patel. I am based at CAS at Lancaster University, and I specialise in corpus-assisted discourse analysis as well. And I am the other senior research associate on this Quo VaDis project.
Great, great. Okay, right. I'll be provocative then. Okay. I've got a great big mound of data, and I look at it with great satisfaction and say, I've got 30 million words of this, 20 million words of that. And I can look at discourses about vaccination. How do I do that plausibly with a scale of data that I can't personally comprehend? So surely some software must mediate between my understanding of the data and the data itself. So if somebody says to me, read Romeo and Juliet, and then we'll talk about it, I can comprehend the text. I can read it, think about it, go back and talk about it. No parts of the text to go back in and look at, etc. It's sort of comprehensible. It's possible. This isn't possible with your 30 million words. So what are the methods that you use to look at a data on a scale that you can't actually comprehend yourself by traditional methods?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we use something called corpus linguistic methods, and essentially this is computer mediated, and we use specialist software systems. So they're like specifically designed for linguistic analysis, and we input our data in. So as William said, we make them corpus friendly, turning them into XML, TXTs, that kind of thing. Yeah. We input them into the software.
And then, drum roll, and then
and then we have quite a few options, because the analytical capability of these software programs are very diverse, and there's multiple different types of analyses we can do with them. It really depends on the goals. So I can give you an example from our Mumsnet analysis if you'd like, since we've mentioned Mumsnet. So as William said, we had a very big data set of threads posted under in the Mumsnet forum. And when we were doing initial research about Mumsnet, we found that there was a particular section of the Mumsnet forum called Am I Being Unreasonable? And this was renowned for confrontational exchanges between users and for being quite combative, particularly in comparison to the remainder of the Mumsnet forum. Now, there was no linguistic evidence of this. This was all just anecdotal. And we, from our perspective, were interested in this Am I Being Unreasonable section, because it houses hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of threads about vaccinations. And at the end of the day, that's what we're interested in exploring, is vaccination discourse. So we were interested in looking there anyway, but we also knew that with the methods that we use, we would also be able to explore whether the rumours are true and whether Am I Being Unreasonable is actually more confrontational in the context of vaccination discourse for us anyway, compared to other areas. So essentially what we did was we had
waiting for this.
we had a corpus of threads about vaccinations that were posted under Am I Being Unreasonable? So we input that into our software. We then collected a secondary reference or comparative corpus of threads about vaccinations that were posted elsewhere in Mumsnet, and we input that into our software as well. And then we did a type of analysis.
Looking at some type of contrast then? That's what you want to do?
Yeah, it's a comparative analysis, and we call it a keyness analysis.
Okay.
So we input them both in, and then we say to the software, can you compare the word frequencies in both of these two data sets? And the software does this in a matter of seconds, and it uses a variety of different statistical measures, and it gives you a list of words which are called keywords. And these words are words that occur unusually frequently in the data set that you're interested in compared to this comparative data set that you've got. And what these keywords represent is they really demonstrate what's linguistically unique about your data set compared to the comparative data set that you've input. And what we found with these keywords that we were presented with when we did this analysis, comparing Am I Being Unreasonable to other areas of Mumsnet, we found a lot of insults like the word idiot, and a lot more that are not as PG, so I won't repeat them here. But that demonstrated to us that insults within the context of vaccination discourse seemed to be more typical of threads posted under Am I Being Unreasonable compared to these other areas of Mumsnet.
Okay.
And once we've got that information, we can then take a more in-depth qualitative look at the insults in use and see what they're being used. Oh, sorry, you go.
Okay, but before you get to that, just let's back up a tiny bit. You've got the contrast. I can get that. So you're saying, I think there are these conflict behaviours in here, and people don't say that they're in there. So if I contrast these two together, my focus is on words. Okay. There might be other focuses you could have, but let's say words are fine. And there's some words here which seem very frequent relative to over here. So my focus is on, and you gave the example of the word idiot. But of course, words can have a range of meanings or usages. How do you actually say, well, actually, this word in this context has this meaning or usage? So, for example, I might find a word like, I don't know, cloud. Not in your example, but say if I found the word cloud, or cloud could be referring to a notional cloud, like the cloud on the web, or it could be something up in the sky, etc. How do you actually analyze this? You can't just look at them and say, well, it's got the word cloud there, so it must mean this. There must be some other process there that you're engaged with, either computationally or you as a human analyst, to actually say, in this specific context, it means this.
Yeah, so essentially the software is great because once you've got this list of words, if you click on the word, it then gives you all the examples of the word in use.
Right.
So what we're able to do is then read through all the examples in which it occurs, and then we can determine as analysts how it's being used. So that's where we go from the more quantitative approach to the more qualitative.
And if only I'd shut up, you just mentioned qualitative before I pulled you back and you would have told me these things. Okay, but let me just check that then, because I suppose what you're not doing is a sort of automatic analysis where at the end of it, a little answer pops out of a machine like a prize from something where you pop in money and maybe a fruit machine or something and the coins drop out. That's not what you're doing. What you're describing to me is a process whereby you're almost downsampling. You're taking a very large data set that you can't comprehend, and then you're using a technique to focus in on specific words and contexts and examples. And then the scale of the data is such that you can comprehend it, but you've also been guided to that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. We use the software to help point us towards prevalent linguistic patterns, point us towards what's typical or also what's rare within the data, and then we go from there.
So linguists aren't out of jobs, it's just that you're giving them a way of scaling analyses which are too large for them to comprehend down to a scale which is comprehensible, but in a principled way. You're not just saying, well, just look at 10, just look at 100. You're saying, look at these 100 because of frequency. And I can see that, frequency is something that you could get from the corpus data that I guess it's very hard for people to use otherwise. So my comment earlier on, don't ignore qualitative methods, is actually accurate in the sense that ultimately you use qualitative methods to interpret But you use the quantitative to guide you towards what you interpret. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. Well, that's sounding quite persuasive, Tara. Other than keywords, any other methods that you'd want to mention that are important to the analyses that we might hear some of your colleagues talking about in a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, the analytical capability of the software is really diverse. So you can do a keyness analysis. You could also search for particular words or strings of words. You can look at patterns of co-occurrence. So this is something called a collocation analysis. Yeah. So this is where you have a word of interest. So let's say the word COVID, for example, and you look at the words that frequently co-occur with the word COVID. And patterns of co-occurrence are really interesting to look at from a linguistic perspective, because the words that are used with other words, they can give you more insight into the intent behind certain word choices. They can also give you a bit of a better insight into the meaning behind the language that you're looking at. And so looking at co-occurrence is something that we do a lot and something that we have done a lot in this project as well.
Okay. Last question then. When you look into your marvelous toolbox, which is what your software sounds like, which tool do you pick up first and why?
Well, it really depends on what you want to get out of the research. If you're interested in just doing a completely exploratory analysis, you don't have any kind of preconceived notions, or you don't have one of your research questions isn't specific at looking at a specific, how something specific is represented in this data set. If you want to just broadly look at what's going on, then I would probably start with a keyness analysis, looking at what's typical within your data, because that's how you can then explore the kind of prevalent but also typical aspects of your data from a linguistic perspective. But if you are interested in looking at how a certain topic or subject is represented, then I would maybe start by searching for that word and then looking at how it's used, how often it's used, looking at what words it co-occurs with, and looking at, you can also see if it occurs within prevalent clusters of words. So if it's used in a frequent phrase or something like that, and then all of these can help you downsample the data, and then you can then take the more qualitative approach and really get into the weeds of how it's being used.
That's great. So you can sort of enter it relatively naively and try to generate hypotheses out of a sort of bottom-up approach, or you can enter it with a hypothesis and try a more sort of top-down look at the data, and that sort of dictates different uses of the tools and different tools that you might use in order to work. Okay, I've got that. Right. Will has convinced me that you can get lots of data and you can compose it in such a way as to be able to do various things that you might not be able to do with other methods, and that he can do it. Very clever man. Then Tara's convinced me that there are great methods out there and you can use them, and you can go top down, you can go bottom up, you can bring hypotheses, you can develop a very, very clever researcher, wonderful stuff. But I wonder whether people in the medical community, for example, would be interested or receptive to some of the insights that emerge from such work. So I'm now going to turn to Derek, and that will sort of be the sort of cloud hanging over our discussion, Derek, because of the plausibility, utility, helpfulness of insights of this sort within the medical community more generally. But first of all, just tell me about you, Derek.
Yeah, I'm Derek Gatherer. I work in biomedical and life sciences, also at Lancaster University. So I'm the only person, I think, in the room that isn't a corpus linguist of one kind or another. But I've been interested in infectious diseases for many years, and recently I've been working on vaccines and related matters. So to get involved in a project on vaccine hesitancy is really right up my street indeed.
Great. Okay, so you can convince me at this point then, given your background, which sounds absolutely wonderful, why are you interested in working with linguists to look at something where people might casually think this is the domain purely of people in white lab coats?
Well, we'd like to know why it is that people are vaccine hesitant, and we still don't really know the answer. It's clear that there are many, many different reasons why people are vaccine hesitant.
Vaccine hesitant means they pause before they get it. I find this hard to understand. You see, I'm like a sort of a pincushion. Every time a vaccine's offered to me, in it goes, straight away.
Well, I mean,
but there are people who worry about this.
That's right. Yes, hesitancy measures a degree of reluctance, so it's not like everybody is as enthusiastic as you are and as I am. But that some people are complete rejectionists, but then there's a lot of people that are in the middle that might have one vaccine but not another, and so on. So this is why the concept of vaccine hesitancy has arisen, and it really dates from around about 2008. I think the first example I found is the Oregon Vaccine Hesitancy Scale, which was a 5-point questionnaire prepared by the State of Oregon Department of Human Services to assess the degree to which people were likely to take up vaccines. That's relevant in that state of the USA because you have to be vaccinated to get into primary school, to get a child into primary school. So they wanted to measure this, and since then the vaccine hesitancy has taken off as a field in its own right. So from about 2010 onwards, you see vaccine hesitancy appearing as a phrase in the scientific literature. It's become an interdisciplinary research area, and one of which, part of which is this kind of project that we're doing now.
Great. Well, I'm going to carry on along these lines, but just a diversion for a moment. Will before mention something about the Victorian era, which predates 2008.
Yes,
why is he looking at that?
Well, vaccine hesitancy, although it wasn't called that, goes right the way back to the very beginning. So that the famous Gilray cartoon that often appears on television and in popular expositions of the subject, the one where you see the Jenner depicted vaccinating people and cows popping out of their arms and so on because he was using a cowpox vaccine against smallpox. That was actually from 1802, which is a mere 3 years after Jenner's paper. So there was some considerable opposition right from the very start. But anti-vaccination doesn't really take off as an organised movement until the 1850s because of the Vaccination Act of 1853, which makes vaccination compulsory. Its full name was an act further to extend and make compulsory the practice of vaccination. So effectively, that was what energised the vaccine hesitancy sentiment in the country into an organised movement, which then started to make quite a lot of trouble for the medical establishment.
I'll return to that in a moment then. But for now, listening to what you've just said, it sounds as though there is a strong social component in this. It's not simply a question of people listening to scientific advice. I don't think any serious scientist would suggest that somehow you become cow simply by having a vaccine based on cowpox. So it sounds as though, well, is this why you're interested in working with linguists? Because the objection must have its root in the social rather than the scientific, the metaphysical rather than the scientific.
Yes, and we're also accessing a fairly large body of data, as William mentioned earlier on. It's about 3.5 million words, our Victorian database, so it's quite small, but it's from very heterogeneous sources and often written by people that are not members of the medical profession, although there were a few rogue members of the medical profession and scientists, you might say, that did participate in it, but mostly it was written by what you might call, I suppose, lower middle class or middle class people. They had to be literate, but often you can tell that they're not professional by their style of writing, and that there's a range of different styles of writing, from the sort of parodic, parody type writing, and then there's very strenuous polemics, and then there's quasi-philosophical stuff, and so forth. So there's all sorts of different styles in there, and all manner of different genres within the corpus. So we have letters to newspapers, we have articles within anti-vaccination publications, we have street pamphlets that would have been handed out in street corners. Occasionally we have longer monographs, both booklet kind of length and the occasional longer works. There's lots of different genres, lots of different types of author, so it lends itself to a kind of corpus linguistic analysis.
And I'm guessing that in there, Derek, there must be lots of different types of objections, because if we're moving away from the purely scientific and towards this more social arena, then we must find lots of different reasons that vaccine hesitancy is there, from the fantastical maybe through to the more principled religious objections, or personal objections, or simple fear.
Yeah, well, there is one school of thought within the historians that have analysed the anti-vaccination literature that nothing much has changed, and I don't think that we can quite say that very strongly. It's not that the arguments used by the Victorians are exactly the same as the arguments that we use today, but you can see that there are some themes that come across. For instance, there's concerns about about safety. Just as we saw with COVID-19, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, there was some concern about blood clots, and the committee on the advisory committee on vaccination and immunisation had to modify the protocols for blood clots. So just as we see that in the modern day, in Victorian times, we see concern about syphilis being transmitted from arm to arm. And we have to remember that there was no real notion of sterility until about the 1850s, and it wasn't really taken up in this country till Lister came in and started doing aseptic or antiseptic practices and operations in the 1860s. So for a lot of the period that we're studying, the public vaccinators would have been operating from arm to arm in a very what we nowadays would regard as a dangerous manner, that was danger of transmitting diseases. And some medical papers did appear on this, and there was discussion about how do we improve sterility and so on. And of course, this was seized on by the anti-vaccinators as evidence that the practice was unsafe. So that's a parallel with a modern situation. Also, we have parallels with the modern scare stories. So just as today we have a completely spurious scare stories about autism and the MMR vaccine, in Victorian times, people were talking about madness, about mental health, as we would say nowadays. The Victorians were building lots of asylums, and they were filling up rapidly. And people were saying, "Why is that? Why are there so many insane?"
It's vaccination.
Yes, it's vaccination, and also tooth decay as well was another one that came up. That the dentists were observing more children with decayed teeth, and that also was blamed on vaccination. So those are two kind of Victorian parallels to the scare stories that we see today. One big difference, though, is that in Victorian times we had an organised entity, or rather two large organised entities that were organising the movement, whereas nowadays we don't have a single big or even small anti-vaccination organisation. It truly is a sort of social media phenomenon. And I do like to tell people that street pamphlets were the social media of Victorian times, but that's not quite correct, because of course you in social media you can respond immediately and conversations can go on. With distributed pamphlets, there always has to be the distributor and those to whom they are distributed, and they don't necessarily get to reply. But you do see within a lot of the pamphlets things which are obviously paraphrased and plagiarized, you might say, because people were encouraged to copy things and reproduce them in their own. So you get these kind of hints of reposting, I suppose, is the modern equivalent. It's like reposting.
Well, that's very helpful, Derek, and you've convinced. Well, I can see why scientists would be interested in vaccine hesitancy then. So there's the science of vaccination, and then there's the social practice of it. And the social practice of it, to some extent, is influenced and mediated by discourse, what people say about it, what they come to believe through discourse. And you've shown me that when vaccination started, it was born into contention and competing discourses. So I'm going to leave you now, Derek, and turn now to Claire, because I know that your work touches on conflict and social media. So tell me a little about yourself, Claire, and then I'll have some questions for you.
Sure. So I am Claire Hardaker. I'm a forensic corpus linguist, and one of my long-standing interests has been aggression, conflict, abuse online, particularly in large amounts of online data. So for this project, I bring both the corpus linguistics sort of expertise that I have, but also my specialism in conflictive and argumentative discourse. Okay.
Right. Well, we've just heard from Derek about how, conflictive and argumentative discourse was where vaccination was almost born, by the sound of things. Is it worse with social media? Is it the same? Can you see different processes? What's happening because of social media?
Well, it is interesting because Derek sort of mentioned the fact that the pamphlets that he looked at in the Victorian corpus are a little bit like the social media of the day. There's differences, of course. So you have this ability for the ordinary person, as long as they were literate, they didn't have to be an expert, they didn't have to have a high degree of education in the field, they could print, produce, hand out, distribute this content. There was no form of quality control. A lot like the internet that we have today. They could be passed from hand to hand, you could be read out to people, they could plagiarize. So there was a lot of sort of forwarding and liking and reposting in that respect. They could be produced very quickly, very cheaply. So there are plenty of parallels that make this content very like the social media of today. except as Derek mentioned, you don't have that right to reply. And so when you look at the content of today, you actually see some striking similarities again. So just to pick up, Tara talked a little bit about Mumsnet, and I may as well pick up with that one as well. So this is a sort of a forum where you would post a question or a query or a dilemma, particularly the Am I Being Unreasonable forum, which is on there, the IBU forum. You would post this content and you would invite lots of people to respond. So the difference between that historical context and this modern context is you get this textual written record that we can now look back at. And so you can actually see whether or not these questions and debates triggered conflict, or if they were themselves sources of conflict. So obviously the historical documents, we have people campaigning against the mandatory notion of vaccines and sort of having concerns about whether or not it was ethical, whether there were religious issues around it, whether it was medically dangerous. And you find some really interesting comparable arguments and discussions going on in the modern data of people effectively sort of saying, I'm really worried about my daughter. She's always been a little bit fragile. If she has this vaccination, is that going to be an issue? And then you would get people responding. And in some cases, this blows up into big arguments. And in other cases, it's actually quite sort of, let's say, cooperative, but there can still be elements of conflict in there.
Okay. In terms of just taking a step back from vaccination for the moment, in terms of other conflicts and disinformation campaigns, for example, that we see on social media, how distinct is this area from that, or is it a variety of a larger set of issues with social media?
So the sense that I have from the data that we've looked at is that it's an issue that lends itself very nicely to disinformation. And so I don't want to tread too much into sort of Elena's expertise here, but what we find with this is because disinformative stories can be very engaging, very gripping, very dramatic, they don't have to be grounded in reality or the truth. And vaccination stories of things going wrong are, of course, something that we can all kind of get really worried about. It's something we can be invested in. So it's an area that's very rich for disinformative type content to be built up on and say, you know, my child had a vaccine and then they had all of these issues, and this is an ongoing lifelong issue, where when you contrast it with effectively a much more factual, unexciting version of events where I had a vaccine and nothing happened, it's far easier for those dramatic narratives to come to the fore. So it's a very rich area for driving in wedges to polarize people, to really get people arguing. And so you have people very much in the vaccines are majority fine, for the vast majority of people they're fine, and this much smaller niche of people saying, no, this is a problem, but that much smaller voice can still have that magnitude and loudness simply because those stories are naturally just that much more gripping. Okay,
well, I'll put Elena on warning that I'm going to ask her to talk about narrative because I know it's an area where she has expertise. So I'll return to that point with you, Elena, if that's okay later. But for now, Claire, can I just sort of check another thing? You know, from what Derek said, in the Victorian era, we saw individuals or small groups of individuals, if you like, being the people who championed these views and handed out pamphlets, etc. And on Mumsnet, I'm guessing it's individuals who are writing up there. But on the internet, of course, we can have a whole range of actors spreading disinformation for a whole host of reasons. Bot farms or troll farms, I think they have. In Russia, and also bots which go out handing out disinformation, etc. Do you see a role for state actors in these campaigns, like around anti-vax, and why do they do it, and how effective are they?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of the major issues that we have, in that if you have state-sponsored disinformation campaigns, for instance, coming in from any other, it could be politically from within that country or externally, it could be from wherever. Issues like this are a really rich area to jump onto and to kind of sow those seeds of doubt and concern. And the point, sometimes I think the thing that people can miss is the point isn't to achieve a consensus around a topic that is perhaps different to the one that's held by the current population. It's just to stoke conflict so that everyone is busily infighting with each other. It's not about let's make everybody agree that, for instance, vaccines are all bad or that vaccines are all good. It's just get people fighting about it. So if you have a bot farm or some kind of troll farm producing this disinformation, and it can be on a massive scale, it's very simple to create a small piece of software to produce huge amounts of content. As long as it's inflammatory and gripping enough, you can have rafts of people arguing with each other, generating lots of smoke and not much light, lots of heat, not much light, and effectively derailing entire conversations. So in that context, it then makes it really difficult for medical professionals, for instance, to try to put in calming educational material to say, look, this is the real state of affairs, because you have so much noise drowning out any actual good quality signal.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. So I dare say there are still individuals who hold beliefs, sincere and otherwise, that might make them hesitant or even against vaccination, but there are also state actors who simply are seeking fragmentation within societies, and this is one of the many issues they may pick up on. Okay, and again, sort of reflecting back on what Tara and Will said, I could see, well, maybe it would be very useful to look at large volumes of data to try and draw out these threads, because I very much doubt they say, hello, Boris from St. Petersburg here, here's my anti-vax opinions. I imagine there's some degree of deception about this, and you'd need sufficient evidence to be able to see the patterns that might indicate deception.
You do, absolutely. So being able to look at, I mean, if you want to do sort of a forensic linguistics perspective, you could look at the language of it. You could look at what we call pattern of life data, which is when they are posting versus who they say they are. So we've had some interesting cases in other data sets where people have said, you know, I'm a nurse in the US and I've had another case of a person who's had a vaccine injury. But when you look at their pattern of life postings, it's much more consistent with someone in a different part of the world from the point when they would get up and go to bed or what have you. So you can draw together lots of information. You can establish networks within your data to sort of try and figure out what's actually going on.
Okay, yeah. So is there any sort of linguistic innovation in there? You know, I think of vaccines. Is vaccine itself just used as the term, or can we sometimes find linguistic innovation which are trying to sort of push people towards different views of something like a vaccination?
Well, we do have some interesting elements in the data. So to sort of come back to conflict more generally, we have a lot of debate and discussion in our various data sets. So Mumsnet obviously is the major one that we've mentioned a few times, where what was interesting, just to rewind a minute, is that in the Am I Being Unreasonable forum, we did actually find lots of conflict. Tara mentioned that there's lots of insult words. But what was quite interesting about that is that we didn't actually find all that much of people arguing with each other within the group, for instance, which is what we expected. IBU and Mumsnet is sort of infamous, if you like, for being very conflictive, for being very straight spoken, for people just coming out with their comments or their opinions really bluntly. And so we expected to find a lot of infighting. And so Tara obviously mentioned that we found lots of insult words. But when you actually look into that, what you find is quite a lot of people who they've sort of posted a story where they said, for instance, you know, my in-laws have come over and they are very anti-vax and they're causing all kinds of problems because I want to go and get my kids vaccinated. What can I do? And then when you find the conflict within that, what you're actually finding is a lot of people targeting these external characters and sort of saying your in-laws are idiots, your in-laws need to butt out, they need to let you make your decisions, etc. So we've got there is conflict in there, but it's a very interesting, almost collaborative conflict where they're using it to say, I'm on your side, I'm on your team. And so the interesting thing about that is, it's nice for the person who's posted to have that support to say we're generally on your side, but does it actually polarize the debate further? Does it make people drift further and more strongly into a position than they would otherwise hold because they feel like they've got that safe little bubble and there are these outsiders who are being attacked, the anti-vax group, for instance, if that's the case? So we have that interesting, there is conflict, but it's more nuanced. It's not just people being rude to each other on Mumsnet, for instance. And there's that aspect of it as well, but there is also the other aspect that within that, even people who are effectively all on the same team still have arguments within themselves, within their group, about what various issues mean. So to pick on one of these, you mentioned the terminology around vaccines. There isn't even really agreement on things like whether the COVID vaccine should be called, for instance, a vaccine, or if it should be called a shot.
A shot?
Exactly. So is it like a flu shot? Should we call it the COVID shot, or should we call it the COVID vaccine? And that sort of brings in a whole bunch of baggage that we didn't realize we were going to find. But there's a lot of argument about this too.
Okay, right. You've given me some red meat to chew on. Thank you, Claire. I'm going to turn to Alice. And Alice, maybe you'll introduce yourself and then I'll ask you a question about this shot business. Alice.
Okay, sure. So my name's Alice Deignan. I'm at Leeds University and I'm one of the co-investigators on the project. My original background was language teaching, and through that lexis, meaning words, and corpus linguistics and their real world applications. And I'm fascinated by words themselves.
Okay.
During my career, I've been a lexicographer or dictionary writer.
Good. Well, in that case, we have a word in front of us, the word shot. Shot being used as a sort of near synonym of sorts, I'd guess, for vaccination.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Okay, so I've always been interested in the idea of synonymy, words that appear to mean the same thing.
Yeah.
And of course, if you pin a linguist down about that, they'll say, no, there's no such thing, there's no synonymy. Words never mean exactly the same thing. And actually, once you look more closely in the way that Tara and William have described, and you look at loads and loads of examples of language being used in real life, you'll see that it's true. They pretty much never mean exactly the same thing. And there are almost always some subtle differences, whether it's the actual meaning or the connotations and associations or regional variations or whatever. And what's also really fascinating is that over periods of time, words, you can actually trace the meaning of words diverging slightly. And that seems to be what's happened here, right, with vaccine and shot.
So what's the difference between the two then?
Okay. Well, I'm not claiming a scientific difference here. I'm talking about the way that they're actually used in our corpus.
Okay, health warning noted.
Yeah. A shot isn't a vaccine, essentially, in a nutshell. A shot isn't a vaccine. If we look at a very general corpus, some of the really large collections that are publicly available of language, we can see that going back to way before the recent COVID-19 pandemic, the main illness word that collocates with shot is flu. So people talk about flu shots. Yeah. And in British English, sometimes jab as well, flu jab. And we look back at those examples of flu shot and flu jab, and it was all quite sort of cosy and a routine part of life for lots of older people or people whose health was vulnerable. So people would talk about, I thought I might get the flu jab, it's a tenner, or he's had his flu shot. And I thought to start with, well, this bodes quite well for the idea of a COVID shot. Maybe people will start to think of it as just like it's what you do in the winter is you get a COVID shot, no big deal. So that seemed great. But then when we dug deeper, we found that that was not actually the case. What started to happen, and in our data, so talking about Twitter here, what seemed to happen around 2021, which was about when everybody was starting to get vaccinated, was that flu shot was occurring more and more in our data collections in a negative light. We searched for collocations, which, as Tara mentioned previously, is when you get words occurring with each other. We looked for flu shot, which came up in our data quite a lot. And in quite a lot of the cases, people were comparing flu shots very negatively with vaccines, and that tendency grew. And then COVID shot became the main way of talking about the COVID vaccination in our data, and it started to look a little bit worrying. We then searched for, okay, so if we've got vaccine and shot, we'll use the software to find all the examples that we've got of vaccine and shot near each other. And of course, as we've said, the advantage of this is we're not just looking at one person saying one thing, which might be biased, but we're looking at hundreds and sometimes thousands of examples. And we found when shot and vaccine are used within a few words of each other, shot is being compared negatively to a vaccine, and COVID is being, a COVID shot is inferior to a vaccine, which is worrying.
Yeah, it's a very good example in a way of what Derek was talking about before, his interest in how the social dimensions of vaccination, in this case discourse about them, talking about them, could start to influence behaviour. So if you convince people that it's, if I've got this right, Alice, this is a shot, not a vaccine, this is ineffective, not effective, then you might actually promote vaccine hesitancy, which might explain to the scientists why people aren't coming forward and getting their arm filled with this good stuff. Is that about right?
It's a definite possibility, yes. I mean, there were various reasons why they came up with this, and some of this will be folk mythology, and some of it has a sort of semi-scientific basis. So, a vaccine, you only need it once. Yeah. They said a shot, well, you keep having to have more of them. So what good is that? Real vaccines prevent you from getting the illness, but I think many of us have had the COVID vaccination and still got COVID, but probably much less severely than we would have done otherwise. And sometimes people were talking about the technology. So various reasons were being given. So it seems like the more general vaccination hesitancy had kind of morphed into a slightly more sophisticated argument. It's not a real vaccine, it's inferior in some way.
It's this thing called a shot.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, in amongst the discussion there, Alice, you started talking about people almost using personal narratives, little stories about their experience or the experience of others. And with Claire, we also heard about how maybe trolls and bots might use false experiences in order to deceive people. And then that was mentioned earlier on by Derek too. So I'm now going to move to Elena, if that's okay. So Elena, I want to hear about stories, but first of all, I want to hear about you.
Hi, I'm Elena Semino. I'm a linguist at the University of Lancaster. I've been interested for a long time in looking at discourses around health and illness, and in Quo VaDis, I'm the principal investigator.
Okay, that's great. Well, we've heard lots about stories and narrative. What's the power of narrative? How did they manifest themselves in this context? Are they just little stories of everyday life, or do you think they actually have rhetorical power?
Yeah, narratives are very interesting here. I mean, I've been interested in narratives all my career, but when you look at the literature on persuasion around vaccination, discussions of public health messaging around vaccinations, narratives are very often talked about as one of the ways in which people might be persuaded to hold certain views and to engage in certain behaviors. So narratives and the provision of information, often statistical information, have been contrasted in the literature on persuasion generally, and specifically to do with vaccination. And what was interesting to me and to the rest of us as sort of discourse analysts was that we found a lot of psychological experiments where people, let's say, took two groups of participants and gave them texts that were meant to persuade them to, for example, take up a particular vaccine. But one group got that a text in narrative form as somebody's personal experience, and the other group got some information about the vaccine, its efficacy, its safety, etc. Yep. And then both groups are asked the same questions about to what extent they might take up the vaccine, to what extent they think the illness is serious, etc., etc. So in this literature, every now and again, there is a finding that, at least under some circumstances, narratives might be more persuasive than information. These findings are not always being achieved across the board, but there is this. And this links to the idea that when you process a narrative, even if there is a persuasive intent, you might be so involved in the narrative that you forget that somebody is trying to persuade you to do something. So you get involved in the story world, you identify with the characters, you might be emotionally involved as well, and that might lower your resistance to persuasion. So this was the background that led us to look at our data and narratives in our data.
In terms of the power of narrative in persuasion, then, is there any evidence, there may not be, but it's a thought that occurs to me, is there any evidence that certain groups are more liable to persuasion through that route? So, for example, does it intersect with variables like gender or education or age? Any evidence of that sort?
Yeah, there are some studies that suggest that, but I think more generally, I think there is some evidence that you're more likely to be persuaded by narratives told by people who are similar to you.
Okay.
And that's why, you know, parents look for personal experiences from other parents. And, you know, depending on your gender, you might be looking for, or your age, you might be looking for personal experiences of people who are like you. Rather than perhaps certain kinds of people being more liable to persuasion generally.
Okay, so for people interested in promoting public health, for example, as opposed to misinformation, are there counter narratives that you'd like to put forward? You know, in studies of terrorism and the like, the idea of the counter narrative is a powerful one. So I wonder whether, to some extent, when you're fighting narratives, you need narratives as weapons. Is there any research on how you might produce vaccine hesitancy counter narratives?
Yeah, so yes, there is research, this kind of psychological research does it. And we did find some evidence that I'll tell you about in a moment, that narratives may have particular potential for persuasion. But there is an issue that Claire has already alluded to in terms of producing narratives that might be pro-vaccination and that might counter some of the anti-vaccination narratives. And this was noticed not just by us, but by people in public health. And that is that a good story has some interesting things happening, often negative ones that might then lead to a happy ending or not a happy ending, a tragic ending or whatever. And so a story about somebody being harmed by a vaccine is by definition potentially a more powerful story than a story of somebody who has what I would call an uneventful vaccination. In other words, you know, you go and have your vaccine and either you have no side effects at all, or you might have a bit of a sore arm, right?
Yeah.
That may be, actually, that's what we would want most people to experience, that they go to have a vaccination and nothing much happens. But that doesn't give you that much storytelling material, because basically a story where nothing much happens is not a very good persuasive story. Whereas a story where you have a vaccination and some serious side effects or some prolonged vaccine harms happen, make a better story.
Yeah.
So then the challenge then is, if vaccine uptake doesn't make a good story, what do you do? In our data, especially on Mumsnet, there are some parents who are very good at making a story out of an uneventful vaccination. And they do that by dramatizing the context of vaccination, especially before. So there is one example where somebody says, my daughter didn't want to be vaccinated against the human papilloma virus, HPV, because she's scared of needles. And so we had a long discussion. She didn't want to do it. And then I said, look, and this is a trade-off. I think it's mentioned before how vaccination is steeped in social context, in your family context. The parent says, look, I'll let you off the flu vaccine this year if you will take the HPV vaccine. And so the daughter, okay, said yes, agreed. They were worried that she would have a reaction because she'd had a reaction before, but she didn't. So this person manages to make a kind of a little drama out of actually a vaccination that was uneventful. The other way is to tell stories about the illness that the vaccination is meant to prevent. So these are much more what we call tellable stories, because there is hardship experience, etc. And so that's what often happens, that to persuade people to get vaccinated, what you tell them about are stories, the experiences of people who got the illness that the vaccine is meant to prevent, or to, and that there are other issues to do with that, but that is sometimes what is done.
Okay, good. Well, I've had lots of really good examples this afternoon of insights into the data, and also potentially to ways to remedy some of the misinformation that's there, or identify negative actors who are online, etc. So a big question for you now, Elena. What are you doing about trying to get some of that information into practice, helping the people whose job it is to put out public health messages, to increase uptake of vaccination, improve public health, etc.? Are you doing anything? And if not, why not, I'd say, because it sounds important.
Okay, we're doing our best. So as you can imagine, we thought about this from the beginning, and that is why the project team is interdisciplinary. We have Derek, you've heard from him before. Derek, for example, has recently written an article for The Conversation, which is a publication that goes out to a lot of people. But we also have one of our co-investigators, Richard Gleave, is at the UK Health Security Agency.
Okay.
And so he is in public health and works with people there. So we are obviously not just in contact with Richard, but we're co-writing with him, with co-publishing with people in the domain where you would like to have an influence has many advantages, including the fact that those people might have name recognition in areas where we don't. And so Richard is involved in a couple of our publications, and he's partly mediating, partly is helping us, and in fact this happened multiple times, identify out of all of the things we could do, which things we should prioritize. So we have him and others. So we're gonna speak to the UK Health Security Agency. We have held a workshop for the Oxford Vaccine Group at the University of Oxford, and we have various other things lined up and contacts to pursue. But it is always difficult to achieve the kind of influence or impact that one would like to achieve. But this is when we are putting effort into that. Okay.
The last question on those lines then. That all sounds very plausible, actually, that you could achieve some of the impact that you need in that way. Was that by design from the start? So when you designed the project initially, did you think of having these types of impacts and think of these conduits to research, these people who would be able to inform you of what's possible, but also take the messages that they thought would work away with them? Or is it something that you developed during the project as opportunity permitted?
Yeah, so what we thought about was having the conduits. So it's very difficult at the beginning of a project to know exactly what you're going to find that might be relevant. And in this project in particular, this project was conceived of and submitted before the pandemic, and then it was funded during the pandemic. So actually lots of things changed as a consequence. Yes. However, by having on the team as co-investigators people who work in the domains where you would like to have an influence, you're basically making it much more possible that if you have something that is relevant, that relevance will be realized. And then as we've gone along, we have another advisor who's a professor at Lancaster, but also a pediatric consultant in a hospital in Manchester. And we've spoken with this person multiple times. She's helped us to prioritize. She's suggesting conferences we could present at. So our approach and my approach has always been that once you've got the network of people involved that give you that potential, it's more likely that that potential is realized. It's not guaranteed, but it is more likely that it is realized.
You had those mechanisms designed from the start, and then you populated them with people. Yeah, that sounds very sensible. Good advice, good advice. Okay, well, you've all been incredibly indulgent as I've asked you sort of boneheaded questions about your research. I do apologise if any of it struck you as offensive, but it's very useful to actually dig in with critical questions, and it's certainly been very helpful for me. I think what we can do now is I'll pass over, I think, to Will, who might have been gathering some questions that may have been asked online. Will be the master of ceremonies for this purpose, but I might intervene if I feel like it. Okay, Will.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. There's been a few questions coming in. So I'll go through them one by one and I'll kind of choose who I think might be best to answer them. So there's one here. Is there any clear similarities in vaccine sentiments across the years in the discourse, or are they generally quite different? I think that might be a good one for you, Claire, to talk about comparisons with the Victorian era as well.
Yeah, thank you. So as we've noted in the course of the call, our data stretches all the way back to roughly the beginning of the Victorian era, and we go all the way through to the modern era. And actually, we did find a surprising number of parallels. Obviously, you get differences in how they're realised, but I mean, I suppose fear is probably one of the oldest human emotions, and this is a fear of something that is potentially might take your children away from you, or it might take your own life away from you. So fear is consistent, but how that fear is realised can differ in its specificity. So one of the earlier sort of concerns or fears that comes up in the Victorian corpus is around vaccines being made mandatory. And this is something that Derek has got lots of expertise on, as he can give encyclopedic knowledge on this. It's incredible. So when the various legislation came in to say you have to have vaccines, and if you don't have vaccines, you'll be fined, and then you'll be fined multiple times. Obviously, the context back then was that the scientific rigor in the medical procedures at that point when vaccines were first introduced were very different than they are today. And you had a lot of fears around, yes, but my child was given a vaccine. It wasn't actually medically healthy. It carried syphilis, it carried other diseases. Lots of people did, in fact, have issues around the vaccine process where they got sick or they died. And so you had this fear around, A, my liberties are being taken away from me in the first place. I should have the right to choose for myself, for my children. And B, I'm being forced into something that's actually a little bit risky. And you also had fears around sort of, you know, I'm introducing toxins into my body. So there were these concerns around, you know, if you introduced cow material into your body or pig material into your body, where you have cartoons of people who were growing snouts or curly tails or whatever. They were concerned that it was going to literally change their body. They're like this creation from God, if you like, this very religious, pure thing, and you were going to introduce this impurity, this other animal material, and you were going to have an impact. Now, when you move forward to the modern era, you still get those same fears. So particularly, let's focus on COVID, because that's probably what we all have within our living experience, where it wasn't mandatory in the sense of there being legislation, but for a lot of people to keep their job, their employment, depending on what kind of work you were in, if you were working in a care home, working in the NHS, etc., it was essentially pushed in the direction of you need to have a vaccine if you want to be able to come in and do your job. So it wasn't mandatory in the same way, but effectively the consequences kind of made it frame itself in that same way. And so people said, it's my right, it's my liberty, it's my freedom, I should be allowed to exercise that. Similarly, we also had concerns about people saying this vaccine has been developed so quickly, I'm very suspicious, I'm not sure about the safety of it. So whilst the medical context may have moved on, the speed really unsettled a lot of people. And so they were saying, I don't know if this is safe, and this is brand new and it hasn't been properly tested. And then, of course, we had the issues around the blood clots with one of the vaccines, and that really inflamed that whole sense of, is this a proper, rigorous, safe medical procedure? And we got some interesting reflections between different vaccines about how good they were. But in contrast to, say, for instance, because there is a clear disconnect now, we don't introduce animal materials into vaccines in the same way that was done historically. But when you look in some of the modern examples, you get fears around other types of toxins or issues being introduced into the body. And I know sort of there were elements on the internet where people were concerned that microchips might be introduced, or that it might make you magnetic. So we had a whole series of people sticking things to their arms and being concerned that they'd been sort of somehow made magnetized, or that it would introduce toxins. And we get a bit of a throwback here to the MMR vaccine potentially causing autism, and other vaccines having things like mercury in them. So the actual specifics of the way that those things are manifested have changed over time, but the underlying fears are basically there. Don't take away my freedom of choice. Don't introduce something foreign or dangerous into my body. You know, all of these kinds of fears, they're still there. And what I presume is if we go forward to, God forbid, another pandemic or another vaccine that has to be introduced, it may be different again, but the underlying same themes will still be there. It will just come out slightly differently again.
Well, that was very thorough. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've got a few more questions. I'm going to go through this now. So there's one that I think I'll ask for Tara. So often people provide answers that are exactly what people hope to hear. So Tara, you spoke about IBU on Mumsnet, or am I being unreasonable? So I was going to ask, what is the normal response to am I being unreasonable? Do people get told they're being unreasonable, or what kind of happens?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a mixture of things. I mean, with Mumsnet, there are these standard responses that people can put. So for am I being unreasonable, there is the option for you are being unreasonable or you're not being unreasonable. Now, when we explored the am I being unreasonable thread, we did it in a specific way. We looked at, first of all, discussions of vaccines, but also via the use of insults. So I can speak to what people responded to in that respect. And what we tended to see was that people would use these insults to answer the question, am I being unreasonable, with you are not being unreasonable. So people would respond to their kind of opening statement about where they would typically give a story about some sort of incident that's happened, usually involving a family member. Like, for example, we had a thread where somebody said, am I being unreasonable to vaccinate my children against my partner's wishes? He's very anti-vax. It's caused terrible problems within his family, but I'm really worried about my children and I would like to vaccinate them. And I'm just scared about having a huge argument with him. But is that, is it worse to not prioritize my children's safety? So we had lots of responses where people would use the word idiot, for example, but they would be referring to this ex-partner of hers who didn't agree with vaccinations, and they would say, you're not being unreasonable, your ex-partner is an idiot, you should ignore him, you should go and vaccinate your children. So when we were looking at insults being used on am I being unreasonable, we actually found that more typically the responses were you're not being unreasonable and this is why this other person is being unreasonable in your life. And so that's what we tended to see. So yes, potentially it was a case of people being told what they wanted to hear, but we did also see examples where people would say you're being unreasonable, you should be worried about this vaccine, or you shouldn't be worried about this vaccine because of X, Y, and Z. So it wasn't just always you're not being unreasonable, this other person is an idiot. There was a mixture, but when it came to insults, we did see the main pattern was people saying you're not being unreasonable, this other person that you're talking about is being unreasonable.
Yeah, that's great, thanks. And I think, yeah, like you said there, it's important to remember that there is a mixture. It doesn't tend to be just kind of one or the other, but there's quite a lot going on. So that's really useful. And then there's a question here for Alice as well. So this is quite a kind of practical question. How did you find that there was a difference between the use of vaccine and shot? So the kind of nitty-gritty in terms of how we actually discovered it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, this isn't something that we were particularly anticipating, which is the beauty of this method and using it rigorously. You find what you weren't necessarily looking for. First of all, statistically, we looked for collocations, what statistically co-occurred with vaccine, what was in the environment of the word vaccine and the word shot. And illnesses divided themselves between the two. Which was really, really interesting to start with. And there were various other words that came up quite a lot in that environment, like real vaccine, actual vaccine, true vaccine, and so on. So there was that overview, which gave us a sense that we're not just looking at what one person said, but we're seeing quite a large pattern here from a large number of language users. And then it was the qualitative examination of detailed examples that showed us some really fascinating things and some very kind of stark statements. Things like vaccines are polio, MMR, smallpox. You don't have to get them again. A shot is flu or COVID. You have to keep getting them. Stop calling it a vaccine. It's a shot. And that's quite an extreme one, but there were quite a lot of examples like that. Things and other things like COVID. The COVID vaccine isn't actually a vaccine. It's not a real vaccine. It's more like a flu shot. So there was quite a lot of very explicit contrast between the two terms that we found. And as I said, it wasn't something that we particularly expected. And it built up during the lifetime of the pandemic as well. It was a division that started to be made over exploiting maybe the expression flu shot, which had always been around, but the meanings diverging historically.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. And there's actually a question which I can answer here myself, which is, how did you collect Twitter data? So in terms of how we actually went about doing that, when we collected this data, we used something called the Twitter Academic Research API. API being the fancy term for a data stream, basically. And what this allowed us to do is, once we applied with our kind of academic credentials, we could collect up to 10 million tweets, quite a sizable amount of data in a 30-day period, which allowed us to build our corpora. It's also worth noting, since Twitter has become X and it's kind of rebranded, that this accessibility has been reduced slightly. So while it's still available for some researchers in the EU, the official data route isn't available in the UK anymore. But yeah, that's how we went about collecting our data. I think I'll ask one to Elena now about pro and anti-vaxxers. So have you noticed hesitancy across both pro and anti-vaxxers, for example, linked to criticism and mistrust in governments and elsewhere?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because anti-vaxxers get a lot of publicity. But actually, whenever we looked in our data, and as Tara explained, we often went in we try to go in with an open mind, looking for different kinds of things or seeing what emerged from the data. We found very few cases of people who were truly anti-vax in the sense of being against all vaccines. There were some, but actually not many. And similarly, we probably didn't find that many cases of people like Tony and also myself, who basically, I'm always ready to roll up my sleeve and have a vaccine. So these could be the kind of two polar opposites. What we found, and it is totally reasonable, and I think Derek has also mentioned it, is that a lot of people are somewhere in the middle, and especially when people are moved to write online, for example, on Mumsnet, about vaccinations, it's because they are genuinely undecided. So, for example, we have cases on Mumsnet of people who say, well, I have 3 kids. My 2 kids had all their childhood vaccinations, but actually my 3rd child has a bunch of allergies. They've already had a bad reaction to X, Y, and Z. And now I am concerned about, for example, this particular vaccine, let's say the MMR. I would like them to have the single measles vaccine first or whatever. What shall I do? Or we find people on Twitter, and people have alluded to it, to how we came across this business of shot versus vaccine, is that we were looking at the MMR vaccine on Twitter, references to MMR, and then we started looking at when COVID and MMR were mentioned together. And what we found was that people were describing the COVID vaccine negatively in relation to MMR and other vaccines. So a lot of people are somewhere in the middle. A lot of people are neither anti-vax completely, no pro-vax. A lot of people are trying to make sense of all these different decisions that they have to make in the circumstances that they find themselves in, with the health issues they have, with the kids' circumstances, with their partners and ex-partners, etc. And that is where I think it's both important to understand what's going on, because then people are being persuaded one way or another by the responses they get, but also they are looking for information and they're looking for relevant experiences. And so there is the potential for being persuaded in one direction or the other. So in fact, there's a lot of similarities amongst people who have slight nuances of attitudes towards vaccinations.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. And so there's one final question here, which talks about the kind of the basis for the inferiority of shot to vaccine and kind of why this might have come up in the data. So I think I'll ping this one over to Tara to answer, because I know she's been going through some of these concordance lines recently. So do you want to answer that one, Tara?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and the analysis that we've done in terms of the use of the word shot and vaccine on Twitter has been really interesting. And I think what we've discovered is when we were looking through the tweets where they were describing where they were describing the COVID vaccine as a shot rather than a vaccine, what they tended to say was, it doesn't prevent infection, therefore it's a shot, not a vaccine. So the reasoning behind their use of the word shot was related to efficacy most of the time. And what we did that was quite interesting is, because we started off by looking at how MMR and COVID are discussed together, we were looking in the years 2020 to the end of 2022, because that's when our data ended. What we were interested in doing was looking to see if this use of the word shot, this inferiority of the word shot, occurred before the pandemic, because we had data going from 2008 about the MMR vaccine. So we actually did the analysis that we did in the pandemic era of our corpus, so 2020 to the end of 2022. We did this in the pre-pandemic period as well, so 2008 to the end of 2019. We looked at the word shot. We looked at instances where it collocates with the word vaccine, and read through every single tweet in which they collocate, and we found 0 instances where shot is presented as an inferior medical intervention to a vaccine. And we also did this with when shot collocates with flu, and we found very few instances where, I'm talking like 13 instances out of about 500, where the flu vaccine is presented as an inferior vaccine to the MMR vaccine and is also referred to as a shot. So this phenomenon that we found in the pandemic era, that's very prevalent, really isn't happening in the pre-pandemic period, and we've got such stark results from those. So I think from what we've seen, we can say that the reason that the shot has gone through this kind of like pejoration is to do with efficacy, because that's really what we've been seeing in the data that we've got. And we've got hundreds and hundreds of tweets where people kind of say this is a shot, not a vaccine. It doesn't prevent infection.
And William, if I can just say something very quickly, linking back to what Tony was saying about the potential impact of our findings. So we have shared this observation with multiple people who work in public health, and nobody was aware of the possibility that some people might regard a shot as inferior or different to a vaccine. It was always regarded as this loose, more informal synonym. And what we noticed, and I think you, William, noticed it, is that especially in local vaccination campaigns around flu, local NHS authorities might say, come and get your flu shot. Okay, this is we've noticed it, for example, in the region where we live, and when people say that from a public health perspective, they're not actually using shot as inferior to vaccine. They're using it as a synonym and perhaps less inflammatory than the term vaccine, as a more colloquial alternative. And so this is where our findings can be potentially relevant, that if there are people who think that a shot is different and inferior to a vaccine, then the people who might be using it as a more cuddly, perhaps, I know it's got the kind of metaphorical sense of aggression, but it's more colloquial. They need to be aware that for some people this means come and get something that is not a vaccine, and that is one of the things that we are able to communicate. A small point, but potentially important.
Brilliant. I've just seen one more, oh no, 4 more questions have popped up, so I'll kind of go through these. I think there's one...
William, we need to finish in 8 minutes, so because we have promised everybody that we would finish in 8 minutes.
No, I'll be selective. Well, I'll ask one for Derek, who hasn't answered a question yet, which reads, thanks everyone. Do kind of actual vaccine scientists or medical scientists use corpus linguistics that often? So I suppose, Derek, the question would be, how familiar were you with these kind of methods before you joined Quo VaDis? Are you like, had you seen these kind of studies before?
Well, I'm very familiar with it, or reasonably familiar with it, simply by being at Lancaster, where it's one of the big things that Lancaster does, really, corpus linguistics. So anybody that comes to Lancaster and pays attention to what's going on in general in the university can't fail to to notice corpus linguistics, and I was curious enough to want to find out about it. But in general, no, this is something which is new to this field. And I mentioned previously that vaccine hesitancy is an interdisciplinary research discipline, and our project is part of that. And the whole idea of creating vaccine hesitancy as an interdisciplinary topic is that we can feed in all sorts of technologies and methods that haven't previously been applied to it. One of the big things in what I might call classic vaccine hesitancy research from about 2008 through to a few years ago was that it was all about focus groups and things like that, and it was all about dissemination of public health messages and so on. But now people that study social media experts and corpus linguists are looking more at the actual experience on the ground, how ordinary people react to it and how they form their opinions. So yeah, it's new for us and I think really valuable.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, I think for some kind of closing remarks, if we can call it that, I'll hand back to Tony now to kind of close things up and end the webinar.
Yes, thanks very much, Will, and thank you for hosting the questions. I'm sure there were plenty more, but we don't have time to answer them all. Okay, so thank you, everybody. You've been very open in answering questions. That last question was quite an interesting one because, of course, quite a few of us have done work in different areas of medicine and with the NHS, not just vaccination. Elena's done work involving chronic pain and cancer. I've been involved in work looking at feedback to the NHS. And all of these projects actually proved really helpful, and working with people in the NHS or in hospitals, we found, just as we have with Derek, that there's a great openness to understanding how people actually talk about medicine, how people actually talk about vaccines, how they talk about NHS services, etc. And I've found nothing but sort of open arms and open ears when I've worked with people in the NHS or medical science, and indeed other sciences as well. I've worked with hydrologists, all sorts of people over the years. People are really interested in language. And I was very struck once when I was giving a presentation on some of my work at the Home Office when the chief scientific advisor stood up and told the audience that there wasn't a single question that the Home Office looked at that didn't involve language. And actually that is true of many ministries across government as well. And the more people recognise that and actually recognise the expertise of linguists to look at that language and make sense of it in a nuanced and informed way, the better, in my view. And I think we've had an excellent demonstration of that from the team here today. So thank you very much, those of you who stayed with us to the very end and those of you who have already parted. And thank you especially to everybody here on the Quo VaDis team who've been so open to my questions and the questions from the audience also. So goodbye, everybody.
Bye.